On that day, a violent mob incited by shameless lies told by a defeated president launched the worst attack on our republic since the Civil War. It was harrowing and heartbreaking. We watched as the temple of our democracy, a building we're as familiar with as our own homes, was overrun by a mob bent on murdering the vice president and members of Congress. The mob's goal was clear. They were trying to prevent the peaceful transfer of power to the newly elected president by halting the counting of electoral votes. This insurrection failed, but not before police officers were attacked and had to use deadly force to protect members of Congress. Shots were fired mere feet from the House floor. Because of this horrific attack, 4 private citizens died, 3 police officers lost their lives. Had it not been for the heroic men and women of law enforcement who faced down the mob, there would have been even more bloodshed that day. We know who provoked this attack. That is why 17 House and Senate Republicans joined all congressional Democrats in the bipartisan effort to impeach and convict and I quote, inciting violence against the government of the United States, end quote. To quote Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, quote, there is no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events that day, end quote. But the failures of January 6 go beyond the craven lies and provocations of one man. The federal government was unprepared for this insurrection, even though it was planned in plain sight on social media for the world to see. And despite all the military and law enforcement resources our government can call upon in a crisis, security collapsed in the face of the mob, and reinforcements were delayed for hours as the Capitol was overrun. It is our duty to understand what went wrong that day, to seek accountability, and to take action to prevent this from ever happening again. We are joined today by the Chief of D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, Robert Conte. On January 6, Chief Conte and his officers did not hesitate to answer the call, and over 800 D.C. police officers voluntarily rushed to the aid of the Capitol. D.C. police stood side by side with the Capitol Police and displayed tremendous heroic actions. Chief Conte, we are in your debt. We also have with us 2 cabinet heads from the Trump administration who led key federal agencies on January 6. Neither has publicly testified about their role in these events, and I appreciate their willingness to testify today. Former Acting General Jeffrey Rosen led the Department of Justice, which was reportedly designated as the lead federal agency for coordinating security in Washington on January 6. The potential for violence that day was clear. In December, the New York Police Department warned the FBI that certain protesters viewed January 6 as an opportunity for violent revolt. Then again on January 5th, the FBI office in Norfolk, Virginia, warned that extremists were discussing, quote, specific calls for violence against Congress on January 6, end quote, including a message to, quote, go there, ready for war, end quote. The Justice Department and the FBI have a special duty to warn of domestic terrorist threats. Yet it's clear that despite all of this intelligence, the federal government was not prepared. Today, more than 4 months later, we're still in the dark about exactly what went wrong. Did the Trump administration fail to adequately prepare for violence because it had a blind spot for right-wing domestic terrorism? As the lead agency on January 6, why did the Justice Department, fail to coordinate an effective and timely response to the attack on the Capitol? We simply do not know, In part, that is because neither DOJ nor the FBI have produced a single piece of paper in response to the request sent by 6 House committees, including this one in March. Not a single piece of paper, not a single document. This is completely unacceptable. I was hoping to have FBI Director Christopher Wray here today to address the unanswered questions about the FBI's actions. I sent him multiple invitations and even rescheduled this hearing twice, but he declined to appear. However, I am pleased to announce that Director Wray has agreed to appear before this committee in June, and I look forward to his testimony then. Our final witness today is former Acting Secretary of Defense, Christopher Miller, who led the Department of Defense on January 6. When the Capitol came under siege, the Capitol Police were badly outnumbered. The world looked to the Department of Defense to protect our government from attack. Yet DOD did not authorize the deployment of D.C. National Guard troops to the Capitol until nearly 4 hours after local officials first pled for help. Even though we were under full-scale assault, DOD hesitated until Vice President Pence, not President Trump, gave the order to, quote, clear the Capitol, end quote. DOD's explanations of its own actions have failed to address critical questions. Why did military leaders place unusual restrictions on commanders on the ground? Mr. Miller says that he first learned that the mob had entered the Capitol between 1 p.m. and 1:30 p.m. So why did the Defense Department wait until after 5 p.m. before sending the National Guard to the Capitol? Today's hearing will not be the end of our investigation. This committee, along with other committees in the House, will continue to seek a full accounting of this attack. Even today, our colleagues in the House Administration Committee are asking tough questions of the Inspector General for the architect of the Capitol. This oversight is essential, but we also need an independent, bipartisan commission focused on investigating the root causes of this insurrection. The 9/11 Commission has taught us that even in our most difficult moments, we can come together as one and answer hard questions, as we did as a Congress after 9/11. The 9/11 Commission made dozens of recommendations to overhaul our nation's security and intelligence operations, and Congress followed through in a bipartisan way, passing legislation to implement most of the Commission's bipartisan proposals. We need that same determination, that same resolve and action today. This nation stands at a crossroads, and the path we choose will define American democracy for generations to come. We must reject President Trump's big lie and the violent insurrection it inspired. No member of Congress, whether a freshman representative or a House conference chair, should face punishment for speaking the truth about what happened that day. As Congresswoman Cheney said last night, and I quote, "Remaining silent and ignoring the lie emboldens the liar. We must speak the truth. Our election was not stolen, and America has not failed," end quote. It is time for the American people and this Congress to look at the events of January 6th and say, never again. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Comer, for an opening statement, and I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What happened on January 6th at the U.S. Capitol is unacceptable. Those who committed crimes and violence on January 6th must be held accountable. And the Justice Department is actively working to do just that. As of April 16th, 410 defendants have been arrested. Their names, the charges, and place of arrest are all listed on DOJ's website. The charges include assaulting, resisting, or impeding officers or employees, some of which include using a deadly or dangerous weapon. Some have been charged with conspiracy. Others have been charged with trespassing on federal property. The FBI continues to seek perpetrators of crimes committed on January 6th. The FBI's website is filled with pictures, 866 photos, and videos of individuals being sought in connection with the events on January 6th. Less than a week after the attack on the U.S. Capitol, I joined ranking members Rodney Davis and John Katko in introducing a bill to create a bipartisan commission to investigate the facts and circumstances related to the attack. The commission would also identify, review, and evaluate lessons learned in order to detect, prevent, and respond to such kinds of attacks in the future. But instead of seeking to examine the facts in a bipartisan fashion, Speaker Pelosi and the Democrats have politicized the January 6th attack. Until last week, Speaker Pelosi refused to entertain an even split on the panel. For 3 months, she dragged her feet and failed to build consensus. Meanwhile, the Senate engaged in bipartisan, constructive problem solving. Instead of looking at what we can control, the security at the Capitol, Speaker Pelosi, Chairwoman Maloney, and other Democrats have wrongly targeted perceived conservative technology companies for the role they may have played in this violence. Well, Chairwoman Maloney looked into this issue, and guess what? There was nothing there. That's why you haven't heard anything about it, because there was nothing there. If looking at the facts, it's clear that Facebook, Twitter, and other big tech companies' platforms were used to organize this violence. The FBI and Department of Justice have laid out their roles very clearly in their criminal complaints and indictments. But the Democrats refuse to investigate those companies or even ask tough questions of them. I guess the Democrats just don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. Additionally, Democrats continue to demonize tens of millions of Americans who support President Trump and have legitimate questions about the integrity of the elections. Expressing concern over election integrity is not a seditious act. Plenty of my Democrat colleagues expressed concern in past elections. What is wrong is when individuals take to crime, violence, and mob tactics. This was wrong on January 6th, and this was wrong last summer when several cities across the country were attacked by rioters. The political violence that resulted in the burning of our post offices, the destruction of other federal buildings, mob attacks on live television, violence in the streets of Portland, Minneapolis, and other cities, businesses boarded up with graffiti sprayed everywhere, commerce, even here in D.C., ground to a halt. It's hypocritical that Speaker Pelosi and Democrats refuse to examine the political violence Americans witnessed on television every night last summer. According to one report, officer destruction of other federal buildings, mob attacks on live television, violence in the streets of Portland, Minneapolis, and other cities, businesses boarded up with graffiti sprayed everywhere, commerce, even here in D.C., ground to a halt. It's hypocritical that Speaker Pelosi and Democrats refuse to examine the political violence Americans witnessed on television every night last summer. According to one report, 25 Americans died during these violent political protests in the summer and fall of 2020. Many Americans' property and livelihoods were destroyed. Instead of condemning this violence, many Democrats supported and encouraged it. Kamala Harris even contributed to bail out some of the rioters. Many Democrats continue to engage in such dangerous rhetoric. Democrat Chairwoman Maxine Waters recently called on the public to quote, get more confrontational if there was a verdict of not guilty in the case in Minneapolis. No wonder America thinks Congress is broken. We can't ignore some acts of violence and then use others for political gain, which is what we're doing here today. This is unbecoming of Americans' elected representatives in Congress. The justice system must work its course to hold violent offenders accountable. Congress must examine both the January 6th attack and the violence we witnessed last summer to prevent it from happening. We owe it to the American people to address these acts of violence. The American people deserve better from their elected representatives. I look forward to a constructive examination of missteps that occurred on January 6th and strategies for guarding against these errors in the future. Finally, Madam Chairwoman, I want to tell the families of those who died in the wake of these events that my prayers have been with them over the course of the past several months. Our law enforcement, who put their lives on the line for us each and every day, deserve better from their leaders. They deserve strong and decisive leadership. I'll close now by thanking them and remembering the following. May God bless them and their families. And with that, I yield back.
I would now like to introduce the witnesses that will be testifying today. Our first witness today is Christopher Miller, who is the former Acting Secretary of Defense and who served in that role on January 6th. Then we will hear from Jeffrey Rosen, who is the former Acting Attorney General. He also served in that role on January 6th. Finally, we will hear from Robert Conte, who is the Chief of the Metropolitan Police Department in the District of Columbia. The witnesses will be unmuted so we can swear them in. Please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Mr. Miller, you are now recognized for your testimony. Mr. Miller.
Chairwoman Maloney, and members of this committee, the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol was unconscionable. I'm grateful for the opportunity to provide needed context and insights to this committee about the events of that day and what I believe was your military's appropriate response. This is long overdue. I'd first like to express my thanks for the first responders who tried to contain the mob and defend the Capitol complex and the individuals there. They are true heroes. And that word is overused oftentimes, but definitely not in this case. And as we assess the response, we should not lose sight of their brave actions that day. I served as the Acting Secretary of Defense that day, and as such, I was ultimately responsible for Department of Defense support to local and federal law enforcement agencies who held primary responsibility for safeguarding the Vice President, the members of Congress, and the Capitol complex. My background is summarized in my written statement, but I served in the Army for over 30 years, including service in the District of Columbia Army National Guard and in units with responsibility for protecting Washington, D.C. I have personally led our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in combat in urban environments. Following my retirement from the Army as a full colonel, I resumed government service in a variety of positions in the prior administration, including the National Security Council, where I focused on defeating al-Qaeda and retooling the government to address the challenge of domestic terrorism. I was unanimously confirmed by the Senate to serve as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. On November 9th, 2020, I was designated as the Acting Secretary of Defense and served in that position until the new administration took office. I'm now a private citizen, but I remain focused on supporting the members of the armed forces, veterans, and their families. As to the events leading up to January 6th, on December 31st, 2020, Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser sent a written request to Major General William J. Walker, Commanding General of the District of Columbia National Guard, seeking unarmed National Guard support to the District of Columbia Metropolitan Police Department for planned demonstrations scheduled for 5 and 6 January. I formally approved the request on January 4th, 2021. We received no further request for different or additional support until the Capitol was breached. I want to highlight, you said in my opening statement, I want to clarify between 1 and 1:30, I noticed that the outer perimeter had been breached, not the Capitol itself. I know that's sometimes difficult to understand, but that's one of the purposes of this hearing today, is to make sure we get our lexicon straight. I want to remind you and the American public that during that time, there was irresponsible commentary by the media about a possible military coup, or that advisors to the president were advocating the declaration of martial law. I was also very cognizant of the fears and concerns about the prior use of the military in June 2020 response to protests near the White House. And just before the Electoral College certification, 10 former secretaries of defense signed an op-ed published in the Washington Post warning of the dangers of politicizing and inappropriately using the military. No such thing was going to occur on my watch, but these concerns and hysteria about them nonetheless factored into my decisions regarding the appropriate and limited use of our armed forces to support civilian law enforcement during the Electoral College certification. My obligation to the nation was to prevent a constitutional crisis. Historically, military responses to domestic protests have resulted in violations of Americans' civil rights, and even, in the case of the Kent State protests of the Vietnam War, tragic deaths. In short, I fervently believe the military should not be utilized in such scenarios other than as a last resort, and only when all other assets have been expended. On January 6, 2021, 8,000 local and federal law enforcement officers were on duty in the District of Columbia. I was told during planning sessions that such a force routinely manages demonstrations well north of 100,000 demonstrators. That is what they are trained, equipped, chartered, and expected to do. Many commentators have mischaracterized my instructions and Army Secretary Ryan McCarthy's accompanying guidance as somehow contributing to the inability of the Guard to respond, or even worse, that those instructions somehow enabled the mob to enjoy an easy path to the Capitol. That is completely false. We did not disarm the National Guard. The request from the mayor was for unarmed support of local law enforcement, and we authorized the support she and General Walker requested. At about 2:30, it became clear to me that local and federal law enforcement personnel were insufficient to address the situation, and the Department of Defense would be required to play a much larger role in reestablishing order and maintaining security in Washington, D.C. At 3 p.m., I approved the activation and mobilization of the full District of Columbia National Guard to assist the Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police Department. At 5:20 p.m., National Guard personnel arrived at the Capitol and began operations in support of domestic law enforcement entities there. Order was restored by 8 p.m. that evening, and the Electoral College results were certified. Those of you with military experience or who understand the nature of military deployments will recognize how rapid our response was. Criticism of the military response is unfounded and reflects inexperience with or a lack of understanding of the nature of military operations, or worse, is simply the result of politics. I suspect a combination of both these factors. There are complexities to redeploying forces in an urban environment, and again, the critics disregard the subordinate role the military must play in the rare instances it is necessary to use such force to support domestic law enforcement agencies. This isn't a video game where you can move forces with the flick of a thumb, or a movie that glosses over the logistical challenges and the time required to coordinate and synchronize with the multitude of other entities involved, or with complying with the important legal requirements involved in the use of such forces. I have been in more crisis situations than I can meaningfully recall. I have personally been in riots, fistfights and brawls, gunfights, aircraft mishaps, mortared, rocketed, attacked with improvised explosive devices. And as a leader, I have commanded forces engaged in the most complex and hazardous military activities and operations known to humankind. Good leaders slow things down to plan and then brief their soldiers, ultimately saving time and lives. Assembling soldiers, equipping them correctly, conducting an abbreviated planning session, and briefing all those involved with their task, mission, purpose, limits, and rules of engagement. Coordinating and synchronizing with the police and other domestic agencies on the ground to guarantee the National Guard's movement supported their efforts. moving them from the assembly point to the appropriate location, and deputizing them by a civilian law enforcement official prior to employing them. This is not a mere symbolic exercise. It all takes time. It all takes time. I also had a responsibility to the members of our armed forces and their families to make sure that when I sent them into difficult situations, I sent them in with a plan to not only succeed, but that would spare them unnecessary exposure and spare everyone the consequences of poor planning or execution. Our arrival needed to impress upon the mob that the situation had fundamentally changed with the arrival of disciplined, organized, and overwhelming strength, so that the balance of power had decisively shifted back in favor of the forces of order, and it was in their best interest to give up and give up quickly, and I believe it did. Again, anyone familiar with the culture, nature, and practices of the military and the character of military operations in urban environments would understand the enormous accomplishment of the District of Columbia National Guard and Army leadership in responding so effectively and quickly that afternoon. As General Milley correctly assessed, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military's response that day, the Department of Defense responded at, quote, sprint speed, unquote. I stand by every decision I made on January 6th and the following days. I want to emphasize that our nation's armed forces are to be deployed for domestic law enforcement only when all civilian assets are expended and only as the absolute last resort. To use them for domestic law enforcement in any other manner is contrary to the Constitution and a threat to the Republic. I ask you to consider what the response in Congress and in the media had been if I had unilaterally deployed thousands of troops into Washington, D.C. that morning against the express wishes of the mayor and the Capitol Police, who indicated they were prepared. I know that the brave law enforcement officers serving on the front lines on January 6, 2021, did their best to protect the Capitol, and the individuals, many of who are on this hearing today, were in harm's way from a lawless and ignorant mob acting contrary to nearly 2.5 centuries of peaceful and respectful transfers of power under our Constitution. I'm enormously proud of those National Guard soldiers and airmen who selflessly answered the call on January 6, 2021, and in the subsequent weeks to support domestic law enforcement and our Constitution. Watching them, talking to them, listening to them, and trying to support them as best I could remain the high points of my term as the acting Secretary of Defense. They are America's treasure and our true patriots, our true patriots. We must be worthy of their selfless service and sacrifice. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rosen, you are now recognized for your testimony. Mr. Rosen.
Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, and members of the committee, good morning. My name is Jeff Rosen, and from December 24, 2020 to January 20 of this year, I had the honor of serving as the Acting Attorney General of the United States. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss the actions taken by the Department of Justice on January 6 to help restore order at the Capitol, to enable the completion of Congress's certification of the Electoral College vote, and to begin the process of bringing to justice those who attacked the Capitol. The events of January 6 were a national travesty and an intolerable attack on our democratic values. To those who risked their safety to protect everyone at the Capitol, I honor your bravery. To the families of the Capitol police officers or others who were injured that day or died in the wake of the attack, I extend my deepest sympathy. And to all of you and your staff who lived through that day, I share the justified anger at what you endured. But I also take solace in the fact that our republic never faltered. Buildings were breached, but the Constitution and our shared values were a bulwark against the violent mob. As set out in my written testimony, the Department of Justice prepared appropriately in the period before January 6th, and I'm proud of the department's response on January 6th, when we urgently deployed more than 500 agents and officers from the FBI, ATF, and U.S. Marshals to assist in restoring order at the Capitol. That included the number 2 officials from both DOJ and FBI personally going to the rotunda while the intrusion was still underway. All of these outstanding men and women from DOJ moved with urgency to assist the Capitol Police in the midst of an unprecedented security breach, and they helped to clear and secure the hallowed epicenter of our representative government. As to holding the wrongdoers accountable, I'm also extremely proud of the swift action taken thereafter by DOJ personnel in the FBI and the DC U.S. Attorney's Office to investigate and, where appropriate, begin to prosecute those responsible for the disgraceful attack on the Capitol. I appreciate the importance of today's oversight hearing, and I welcome the opportunity to share with you what I know about the January 6 events in light of my prior role at the Department of Justice. The Justice Department, of course, must always be guided by our Constitution and the rule of law. That is what guided me. The Department of Justice acted with the utmost integrity and urgency to support our institutions of government to the very best of our abilities when the legislative branch came under attack on January 6. The violence that occurred at the Capitol on the afternoon of January 6 should never be repeated. As a society, we need to restore greater respect for our Constitution, for our representative form of government, and for the rule of law. I look forward to your questions about January 6, but should note as a threshold matter that there are some unavoidable limitations on the testimony I can provide at this time. For one, my access to information is limited because I am no longer with the Department of Justice. Further, while the events of that day will be with me forever, my memory is unlikely to be perfect, as I'm sure for all of us, there are some aspects that are seared in memory and others that have become a blur. Moreover, I have been authorized by the Department of Justice to testify here today only on certain topics within the scope of today's hearing, as I'm bound as a lawyer and as a former cabinet officer of the executive branch to maintain some kinds of information in confidence, and also must avoid making any statements that could interfere with the numerous ongoing investigations and prosecutions of individuals involved in the events of January 6. I appreciate your patience and understanding as to those, as I will otherwise do my best to address the events of January 6 as I saw them. With that, thank you for inviting me today, and I'll look forward to your questions.
The gentleman yields back, and our next appointed speaker is Mr. Conte.
Good morning, Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, and members of the committee. I am Robert J. Conte III, Chief of Police of the Metropolitan Police Department, the primary police force in the District of Columbia. I appreciate this opportunity to brief you on the events of January 6, 2021, a dark day for our country. It is critically important that we, members of Congress, district leaders, and residents, and all Americans find answers to questions about the 6th. I'll relate to you the facts as we know them at this time, based on the point of view of the Metropolitan Police Department and the government of the District of Columbia. As with any event with multiple agencies, thousands of people, and almost as many cameras as people, there will inevitably be several perspectives and possibly inconsistencies that will need to be aligned as more information is gathered. I would like to begin by highlighting a few key facts to ensure the committee and the audience understand the very different roles of Mayor Muriel Bowser and the District of Columbia, including MPD and those of congressional and federal authorities. First, MPD is prohibited from entering the Capitol or its grounds to patrol, make arrests, or serve warrants without the consent or request of the Capitol Police Board. Second, unlike any other jurisdiction in the country, the President of the United States, not the Mayor of the District of Columbia, controls the DC National Guard. Any request submitted by the Mayor to mobilize the DC National Guard must be approved by the President, and the scope of the request must be limited to supporting the district's local jurisdiction and authority, which excludes federal entities and property. a request for the Guard assistance at the Capitol or its grounds would have to be made by Capitol Police with the consent of the Department of Defense. Third, since Mayor Bowser declared a public health emergency in March 2020, the District of Columbia has not issued permits for any large gatherings. On the morning of January 6th, MPD was prepared to support our federal partners with a First Amendment assembly that was held primarily on federal land, while continuing to patrol and respond to calls for service throughout city neighborhoods. In preparation for the anticipated demonstrations and the possibility of violence on city streets, the department was fully deployed on 12-hour shifts the week of January 4th, with days off and leave canceled. Our federal partners each had their primary areas of responsibility. The Secret Service was focused on the security of the former president and the White House area. Park Police was focused on the Ellipse and the National Mall. And Capitol Police had responsibility for the Capitol, including both the building and grounds. At Mayor Bowser's request, and in advance of the scheduled demonstrations, mutual aid was requested from several area police departments to be on standby in the district, and more than 300 members of the DC National Guard were deployed on district streets, providing traffic control and other services to allow MPD to support the First Amendment assembly and continue to provide services to DC neighborhoods. What follows is a brief outline of MPD's role in these events. At about 12:45 p.m., the first of 2 pipe bombs were found. The first one at the Republican National Committee headquarters. The second was found about 30 minutes later at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. MPD responded to the scenes for the pipe bombs to assist the Capitol Police. At 12:58 p.m., Chief Sund asked for MPD's assistance to address the growing violent mob at the Capitol. Officers were immediately authorized to deploy to the west front of the Capitol and arrived within minutes. Our members arrived at a chaotic scene. The violent mob quickly overran protective measures at the Capitol prior to the arrival of MPD officers at the West Front. MPD platoons immediately began working to achieve our objectives. 1, stop rioters from entering the Capitol building and remove those that were already inside. 2, secure a perimeter so that the Capitol could be cleared for lawmakers. 3, enable Congress to resume their sessions to demonstrate to our country and the world that our democracy was still intact. And 4, lastly, only once the third objective had been accomplished, begin making arrests of anyone violating the law. At 2:22 p.m., a call was convened with, among others, myself, leadership of the Capitol Police, the DC National Guard, and the Department of the Army. On this call, the Capitol Police Chief made an urgent request for support from the National Guard due to the dire situation we were facing. In the meantime, by 2:30 p.m., the district had requested additional officers from as far away as New Jersey and issued notice of an emergency citywide curfew beginning at 6 p.m. The 7 hours between the urgent call for help from the Capitol Police to MPD and the resumption of work at 8 p.m. by both houses of Congress will be forever etched in the memories of every law enforcement officer who was on the scene, and it is undoubtedly in the minds of the elected officials, congressional staff, and other Capitol employees who were forced to seek safety behind locked doors. Other harm from this traumatic day will be widely felt, but possibly unacknowledged. Law enforcement training neither anticipates nor prepares for hours of hand-to-hand combat. Even brief physical fights are physically and emotionally draining. In closing, I appreciate the opportunity to highlight the heroism of MPD officers and all of the law enforcement officers who responded to the Capitol and put their lives on the line to protect the Capitol, Congress, and our democracy. But to ensure the continued safety of the district and its residents, the federal enclave, MPD officers, and others, we must be frank in looking at several critical issues. The federal police forces in DC are re-examining their security protocols, given the risk of both foreign and domestic terrorism. As the chief of the district's municipal police force, I must think about our preparations, not only for possible attacks, but the daily impact of the changing operations of our federal partners. As they harden targets in the federal enclave, Other buildings in the city under MPD jurisdiction may become more likely targets. Thank you again for the opportunity to brief you today. I'll be happy to answer questions as we try to come to terms with January the 6th. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now recognize myself for questions. On January 6th, Congress was fulfilling its constitutional duty to certify the results of the presidential election. When Vice President Pence, Speaker Pelosi, and other members of Congress had to be quickly evacuated because a violent mob had breached the Capitol. Mr. Miller, you were the acting Secretary of Defense on January 6th. Did President Trump, as the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, call you during the January 6th attack to ensure the Capitol was being secured? Mr. Miller.
No, I had all the authority I needed from the president to fulfill my constitutional duties.
Did you speak with President Trump at all as the attack was unfolding?
On January 6th?
Yes.
No, I did not. I didn't need to. I had all the authority I needed and knew what had to happen. I knew what had to happen.
Did you speak with Vice President Pence during the attack, yes or no?
Yes.
According to a Defense Department timeline, it was Vice President Pence and not President Trump who called during the siege to say the Capitol was not secure and to give you the direction to, quote, clear the Capitol. What specifically did Vice President Pence say to you that day?
Vice President's not in the chain of command. He did not direct me to clear the Capitol. I discussed very briefly with him the situation. He provided insights based on his presence there, and I notified him, or I informed him that by that point, the District of Columbia National Guard was being fully mobilized and was in coordination with local and federal law enforcement to assist in clearing the Capitol.
According to the DoD timeline, the Vice President's call to you occurred at 4:08 p.m., more than 2 hours after the Capitol had been breached. Yet according to this timeline, it was not until after your call with Vice President at 4:32 p.m. that you authorized D.C. National Guard troops to deploy to the Capitol. Did you issue your order in response to the Vice President's call?
No, I issued the order to mobilize the District of Columbia National Guard and provide all necessary support to civilian and local and federal law enforcement at 3. I gave approval at 3 p.m. and the order was issued at 3:04 p.m.
Well, Mr. Miller, your order to deploy came only 24 minutes after the Vice President called you, and your testimony is that they are unrelated. Do I have that right?
I'm sorry, you're going to have to say that again.
That's hard for me to believe, but I'm going to move on. Mr.
What's the
Rosen,
question,
excuse me. Mr. Rosen, let me now turn to you. You were the acting Attorney General on January 6th, and you reported directly to the President. Did you speak to President Trump at all on January 6th?
I did not. I did not require any authorities that the department didn't already have.
Well, I think that the lack of direct communication from President Trump speaks volumes. President Trump swore an oath to protect the Constitution and to faithfully execute his duties as Commander-in-Chief. But when his supporters attacked our nation's capital, the President was nowhere to be found, leaving it to others to scramble to respond. I'd like to close with a few simple questions. Mr. Rosen, you were the head of the Justice Department on January 6th. Do you believe the 2020 presidential election was stolen from President Trump?
Chairwoman Maloney, I addressed that issue in my written statement. I don't really have anything to go beyond that other than to say that there was no evidence presented of widespread fraud of a sufficient scale to overturn the election.
And Mr. Miller, based on his actions leading up to January 6th and on the day of the attack, do you believe President Trump fulfilled his oath to faithfully execute his duties as president and to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution?
Yes.
Well, I think the evidence is clear. The president refused to lift a finger to send aid after he incited a violent rebellion against our republic. The president therefore betrayed his oath of office and betrayed his constitutional duty. My time has expired, and I now recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Outright propaganda and lies are being used to unleash the national security state against law-abiding U.S. citizens, especially Trump voters. The FBI is fishing through homes of veterans and citizens with no criminal records and restricting the liberties of individuals that have never been accused of a crime. Mr. Biden calls January 6th the worst attack since the Civil War. A president was impeached for his alleged role in that riot. It was reported early, totally unconfirmed, that an armed insurrection, quote, beat a police officer to death with a fire extinguisher. The government has even enlisted Americans to turn in their own neighbors. Federal prosecutor Michael Sherwin on CBS News 60 Minutes continued the, quote, shock and awe, end of quote, strategy. Many of my Democrat colleagues oppose the, quote, shock and awe, end of quote, strategy in Iraq. We should similarly oppose its application against American citizens. Mr. Rosen, you claimed that the DOJ would, quote, spare no resources, end of quote. Mr. Rosen, did the DOJ confiscate any firearms from suspects charged with breaching the Capitol on January 6th?
Congressman, as I alluded to in my opening remarks, there are certain limitations about pending investigations and prosecutions.
Mr. Rosen, I'll be looking forward to asking that question of people that can answer it from the Capitol Police and the FBI. But the answer is no. 0 firearms from suspects charged with breaching the Capitol. Mr. Rosen, was Officer Sicknick killed by rioters with a fire extinguisher?
Congressman, Officer Sicknick was there acting in the line of duty and went into harm's way. And I think as others have said, he acted as one of many heroes on that day.
Mr. Rosen, I don't take the hero lightly. He did heroically, but he died of natural causes. Mr. Rosen, was a single individual at or outside the Capitol on January 6th, have they been charged with the crime of insurrection?
Again, if you're asking me about charges that were either made, pending, or being investigated,
Mr. Rosen,
I'm sorry, I'm
thank you
just
once
not
again.
in a position to address those.
Once again, Mr. Rosen, to my knowledge, not a single person has been charged with a crime of insurrection. Mr. Rosen, do you recall the name of the young lady, a veteran wrapped in an American flag, that was killed in the U.S. Capitol?
I do. Her name was Ashley Babbitt.
Yes, Ashley Babbitt. Was Ashley Babbitt armed?
Again, Congressman, I mean to be respectful of
Mr.
your
Rosen,
observations, but I just don't
Mr.
want to
Rosen,
talk about individual
Mr. Rosen,
situations or...
clearly reclaiming my time, Mr. Rosen, no, she wasn't. She was wrapped in a U.S. flag. Was the death of Ashley Babbitt a homicide?
Congressman, I'm not trying to be unhelpful here, but I just cannot comment.
I understand, but I mean, reclaiming my time, as the death certificate says, it was a homicide. Who executed Ashley Babbitt?
Congressman, I'm just going to have to say the same thing here, that I don't want to get into the specific facts and investigations.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Now, Chief Conte, what are the rules of engagement at the D.C. protests?
At DC protests, sir?
Yes.
Yeah, the only time that we engage in donning riot gear, that kind of thing, is when in situations where there's an actual attack that's going on, sir. I'm not sure the.
Well, I appreciate you, and thank you for your service. Madam Chairwoman, my constituents demand answers, but the truth is being censored and covered up. As a result, the DOJ is harassing peaceful patriots across the country. Without accurate answers, conspiracies continue to form. Russia hoax promoter, riot enabler, and Washington State Representative Pramila Jayapal, who objected to the electors in 2016, without the required support of a senator, filed an ethics complaint against me for following the law under 3 U.S.C. Code 15, the Electoral Count Act, which she herself failed at in 2016. 33 of my Democratic colleagues even wildly speculated that Republican members of Congress gave reconnaissance tours to protesters offering no proof whatsoever. I've repeatedly asked for the Capitol footage from before and during January 6th. Such footage would provide answers, could contain exculpatory evidence regarding the outrageous accusations against members of Congress, and most importantly, exonerate the many Americans who peacefully protested and never set foot in the Capitol. Mr. Rosen, wouldn't you agree that the security footage of a public building, of public officials, paid for by public taxpayers, potentially containing exculpatory evidence, should be provided to public defenders?
Congressman, I'm just going to have to refer to my opening remarks again,
Well,
that there are certain limitations I have here
I
today.
do, and I believe the American public should see that footage. Madam Chairwoman, I and the American people commend you for holding this hearing. If my Democratic colleagues really want the truth, they would join me in demanding the release of these Capitol surveillance footage on and the proceedings of January 6th. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I very much appreciate your holding this hearing so that we can bring out the role of the respective parties. And I appreciate, Madam Chair, that you praised the role of the DC Police Department, which needs to come out at this hearing. My questions are for Chief Conte, who illuminated that role in his testimony and who noted that the MPD cannot enter the Capitol without the permission of the Capitol Police Board. And yet, the DC Police Department played a historic role in putting down the insurrection and saving the lives, by the way, of members of Congress, of staff, of employees, and I would say, indeed, of democracy itself. It should be noted that they have been repaid by Republicans who voted unanimously against my DC statehood bill, which is moving along quite well, notwithstanding. And the district meets all the traditional elements that Congress has considered in admitting new states. Surely the role of the MPD on January 6th supports our bill for DC statehood. Chief Conte, I would like to ask you about two bills which can be implemented without statehood. My DC National Guard Act would give the DC mayor control over the DC National Guard. Now, we know that the governors of the states and even of the territories control their National Guards, but the president controls the DC National Guard. If the DC mayor, Chief Conte, had control over the DC National Guard on January 6th, do you believe that the DC National Guard would have been deployed to the Capitol earlier than it was on January the 6th?
Yes, I do believe that.
I think we see that in your deployment when things got out of control and the mayor was finally able to send you to the Capitol. Chief Conte, my DC Police Home Rule Act would repeal the president's authority to federalize the DC Police Department. Now, the president doesn't have the authority to federalize any other state or local police department. During protests in DC after the murder of George Floyd, the Trump administration threatened to federalize the DC Police Department. Chief Conte, do you think the president should have the authority to federalize the DC Police Department?
No, I do not.
Whose authority should, in whose hands should the authority over the DC Police Department be, even without statehood?
The mayor of the District of Columbia.
Madam Chair, it is long past time for Congress to give the DC mayor control over the DC National Guard and to repeal the president's authority to federalize the DC Police Department. I believe the events of January 6th spell that out completely, and I thank you and yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. We are now recognizing the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss. Mr. Heiss is recognized for 5 minutes.
Hey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to take time to comment. Let's see. Let me mute this. There we go. I would like to take some time to comment on how the media and the many Democrats have put forth a narrative that has been circulating around since January 6th and has never been corrected. For example, the narrative that President Trump incited riots on January 6th. I don't even understand, Madam Chair, why you yourself don't speak the truth as to what President Trump actually stated. And what he said on the morning of January 6th, he said that I know that every one of you will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard today. Madam Chair, why don't you talk about how the president used those words, to peacefully and patriotically, instead of cherry picking words that you want to use to portray an image of something that did not happen. The timeline of what happened on January 6th, and these are approximate times, but the best that we have been able to gather. In the ballpark of noon, President Trump began his speech. At about 12:45, violent protesters started arriving at the Capitol. Now, let's keep in mind that the location where the president started his speech, where the speech took place, it's a 45-minute walk from that location to the Capitol. So if the individuals who were at the speech were involved, they would have had to leave before President Trump even started his speech. He started speaking at 12 o'clock, 12:45. The violent protesters arrive at the Capitol around 1 o'clock. The Capitol is overrun, and there are efforts to make a call to the National Guard. Between 1:10 and 1:15, President Trump ends his speech and tells attendees to peacefully and patriotically make their voices heard at the Capitol. About 1:50, the Capitol is breached. Now, in this timeline, it would have been about 2 o'clock before the earliest attendees of Trump's speech could have arrived at the Capitol. So the Capitol is attacked at the right shortly after the president begins his speech. It's breached before individuals could have gotten there. Where is the real narrative in all of that? Another narrative I want to bring up is that the media claims that the tragic death of Officer Brian Sicknick was a result of pro-Trump mobs bashing his skull with a fire extinguisher, which we all know now did not happen. Officer Sicknick, his autopsy revealed that he suffered no blunt trauma. In fact, his mother has since come out saying he died of a stroke. In fact, it was Trump supporters who lost their lives that day, not Trump supporters who were taking the lives of others. You go down the list here. Ashley Babbitt was shot and killed by a Capitol police officer. Kevin Greeson suffered a heart attack. Roseanne Boylan reportedly was crushed by rioters, and Benjamin Phillips died of a stroke. So the narrative needs to be cleared up. The truth matters. I'd also like to discuss what we know about those who were present on the day of the riots that took place. I actually have here something that was sent to me by an individual who was present. He said it was a beautiful day of peaceful, faith-filled support for free elections. When agitators rolled in and began to coordinate a very different agenda, I could see that their spirit was not the same. They were forceful and angry. They were physically disguised, but they could not disguise their spirit. They had tactical gear, walkie-talkies, gas masks, and a plan. I was close and got tear gassed. I saw these agitators from 6 feet away. Make no mistake about it, I was there. We've heard reports of buses of these individuals rolling up. Who were they? Where is the information about these individuals who rolled up? We saw reports of John Sullivan on CNN disguising himself as a reporter, which he was not. He is later found out that he is founder of Insurgent USA. It was involved in insurgent activity, inciting violence. Why is that type of thing not reported? I see my time is running out, but it's unfortunate that Mayor Bowser is not here today. I have a letter from her urging no support from the National Guard and what little support they got. She wanted it for mere crowd control rather than stopping the incidents that were taking place. She should be here today testifying before us. It's extremely irresponsible, in my opinion, that she's not here. It's time that we get at the truth, that we start telling the truth, and we stop creating a narrative that is untrue and misleading to the American people. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I thank the chair for having this hearing. I found it hard to believe the revisionist history that's being offered by my colleagues on the other side. It is not a 45-minute walk from the ellipse to the Capitol. You would think that the gentleman has probably taken that walk himself several times. It's several blocks, and so it just collapses the entire scenario that he has put forward. But Mr. Miller, I live near the Capitol, and on January 5th and January 6th, I had an opportunity to walk through the crowds. They gathered on the 5th and then grew considerably during the 6th. And my personal observation was that the crowds on the 5th, January 5th, were relatively peaceful. I walked in and among them. And then again on the morning of the 6th, the business of Congress, we were compelled to walk back and forth through these crowds as they gathered around the Capitol. What struck me, though, was after President Trump's his speech and how the crowd changed, the mood of the crowd changed after those those remarks. And in addition to what he said about initially a peaceful protest, also in those same remarks that the gentleman from Georgia neglects to repeat, is he said, you better get up to the Capitol and fight like hell or you're not going to have a country anymore. And that's when the mood changed in that crowd. Mr. Miller, you've had some opportunity to comment on that. Let me ask you, you've already done this in an interview with Vice, but for President Trump's speech, do you think anyone would have marched on the Capitol and tried to overrun the Capitol without the President's remarks? I know you've answered this question several times, but I'd like you to answer it for the committee.
I think I'd like to modify my original assessment.
Why am I not surprised about that?
Based on, as Chief Conte said, we are getting more information by the day, by the minute about what happened. And to highlight some other observations that were made, it's clear now that there were although we're going to find out through the Department of Justice process and the legal system, it seems clear that there was some sort of conspiracy where there were organized assault elements that intended to assault the Capitol that day.
Reclaiming my time, I'm just asking you the same question you've answered before. Did the president's remarks incite members to march on the, people in the crowd to march on the Capitol, or did they not?
Well, he clearly offered that they should march on the Capitol, so it goes without saying that his statement resulted in that.
Okay,
The question
I'm
that I
reclaiming
was-
my time.
question I
Let
was
me
trying
just
to
let me just
answer-
share with the committee what you have said before. This is your quote. This is your quote. Would anybody have marched on the Capitol and tried to overrun the Capitol without the president's speech? I think it's pretty much definitive that would not have happened.
I think now I would say that that was not a unitary factor at all.
What's that?
I would like to offer, I have reassessed, it's not the unitary factor at all. It seems clear there was an organized conspiracy with assault elements in place.
In your written testimony for today,
Said.
reclaiming my time again, for your written testimony for today, this morning, you stated the following about the president's quote: "I personally believe his comments encouraged the protesters that day."
That's
that was
a
this
fair
morning.
statement.
So this is a very recent reversal of your testimony.
Absolutely not. That's ridiculous.
You're ridiculous.
Thank you for your thoughts. I also want to highlight.
No, wait a minute. Reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time. You also said, and I quote, "The question is, did he know he was enraging the people?" That's a different matter. And I understand your reluctance to try to portray what was in the president's mind. But in multiple occasions, your testimony, both written and oral, you said, and again, without the president's speech, people would not have marched on the Capitol and tried to overrun the Capitol. And that you wrote, this morning, I personally believe his comments encouraged the president that day. So you understand how not believable your new testimony, your new version of testimony that was apparently created between the time you wrote your testimony this morning and when you came before the committee today.
There's a difference
yield
between
back.
The
marching
gentleman's
on the
time has
Capitol and
expired.
assaulting the Capitol.
You may answer. What? Okay.
There's a difference between marching on the Capitol and assaulting the Capitol. That's the delineation I'm trying to make, despite the partisan attack that I just was subjected to.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gibbs, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay, I wasn't ready for that. First of all, thank you for holding the hearing. I want to associate some of my with my colleague, Mr. Heiss, on the time frame. I think he did made a lot of sense. I'm trying to understand. Well, first of all, Madam Chair, I think we should have had somebody from the Capitol Police Board, maybe to testify too. But anyways, we had these pipe bombs. Chief Conte. They were placed at the RNC and DNC headquarters. Obviously, to me, that was a pre-planned attack. Would you agree? And also, when you responded to these pipe bombs and doing the investigation, had you know what their motivations were, or you could identify who the perpetrators were?
Yes, to answer your question, I do think that these things were pre-planned. We know through investigation that that these devices were set out there or positioned out there by a lone individual. In terms of just our response to that, the Metropolitan Police Department responded along with other federal assets to the threat to mitigate the threat that we were facing at that time.
Do you know if this individual or individuals had any contact or coordination with the people that entered the Capitol?
No, sir. At this point, we do not know that. No one has been apprehended. That investigation continues on.
Okay. The people that illegally entered the Capitol, I've seen some reports. It looked like a lot of them had military type apparel on. gas masks and so far, things like that. Is that correct?
That is accurate, sir. Yes.
So you'd have to, I guess, come to the conclusion that that was pre-planned, initiative before January 6th. Would you concur?
Yeah, yes. We've seen individuals who wear protective gear to demonstrations when they attempt to negatively engage law enforcement. But in this one, with the tactical gear and certainly with the helmets, there was certainly some thoughts that things were going to be bad there.
There's also an FBI report, I believe, I think maybe 3 days before or the day before, a possible violence at the Capitol. Was your department notified? Were you aware of that?
No, sir. Not 3 days before. If you're talking about the intelligence bulletin from Norfolk, no, sir.
And that was, you didn't have notification the day before or not?
No, sir. So, I think my previous testimony at another hearing, we kind of addressed this issue, but the notification was sent through, it was basically sent through an email. It was emailed to various agencies within the intelligence network, but I personally did not receive information regarding
Did the
that.
Capitol Police have notification? Are you aware of or not?
I found out later on that Capitol Police, they did have some information, but this was after January 6th occurred.
Okay. I guess for the other witnesses, there was chatter, apparently there was chatter going around on social media that there, even days before, of organization or coordination. Is our Attorney General, Mr. Rosen, aware, was there any chatter that the Department of Justice was aware of before, days before January 6th?
Congressman, FBI Director Wray has addressed this in a previous hearing, and I gather will again. So let me address it maybe at a high level. There were very robust mechanisms for looking for such things, but the Bureau has to try to sort out what's aspirational versus what's real and corroborated and verified. But they had a mechanism with the police forces and with the other federal partners to share information. And my understanding is that information was shared in a timely way.
Do you think big tech could have had a role to help surface that information out, or not?
Well, I think, again, I'd probably direct you to the FBI for more specifics about this, but it's often the case that they seek assistance from private sector counterparts as well.
Okay, thank you. And I guess I'm out of time now. You go back.
The gentleman yields back, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. The January 6th insurrection was fueled by a big lie, fueled and peddled by the President of the United States, Donald Trump. Mr. Rosen, in your written testimony, you say the Department of Justice did not act on election fraud claims because the department had not seen evidence of widespread fraud, and that you were committed to an orderly and peaceful transfer of power. Is it correct that the department also declined to appoint any special prosecutors, file any lawsuits, or make any public statements questioning the results of the 2020 election?
That's correct.
Prior to January, and I think that's important for the record, these myths that are being perpetrated by some amongst us that there was widespread fraud is simply not borne out by the actions and decisions made by the Department of Justice in the Trump administration itself. Mr. Rosen, prior to January 6th, were you asked or instructed by President Trump to take any action at the department to advance election fraud claims or to seek to overturn any part of the 2020 election results?
Well, Congressman, as as just alluded to in your prior question, I can tell you what the actions of the department were
No,
or
sir.
were not,
No,
what the
sir.
outcome was.
Mr.
I
Rosen.
cannot tell
Mr.
you,
Mr. Rosen.
consistent with my obligations today, about private conversations with the president one way or the other.
We had an unprecedented insurrection that led to 7 deaths, 5 here and 2 suicides, and you're saying this is a privileged communication?
I'm saying that my responsibility is to tell you about the role of the Department of Justice and
No,
the
sir.
actions we took.
Your responsibility is to be accountable to the American people and this Congress. I can't imagine a more critical question. Did you have conversations prior to January 6th with the President of the United States urging you to question or overturn or challenge the election results of 2020? It's a simple question. And by the way, no executive privilege has been invoked prior to this hearing and your testimony, and you've known you were coming here for over a month.
Congressman, respectfully, I understand your interest in the issue, and I've tried to be as forthcoming as I can with regard to the facts at the Department of Justice. When you ask me about communications with the president, I, as a lawyer, don't get to make the decision on whether I can reveal private conversations on that. Other people make that decision, and I've been asked today to stick to within the ground rules that I have to abide by, so that's what I have to do. I'd be happy to check and get back to you.
That would be great, because I think the American people are entitled to an answer, Mr. Rosen, and I think you and I as public servants have an obligation. Did you meet with the President at the White House on January 3rd?
I did.
You did, but you declined to talk, you declined to tell us what the nature of that conversation was about. Is that correct?
I can tell you it did not relate to the planning and preparations for the events of January 6th.
Can you tell us whether in any aspect it involved a discussion about the election itself?
I'm sorry, Congressman, again, respectfully, I don't think it's my role here today to discuss communications with the president in the Oval Office or the White House without authorization to do that. So I've tried to be as forthcoming as I can be and will continue to do, but on that one, I'm not going to be able to answer your question.
Mr. Rosen, before January 3rd, that meeting you confirmed you did have with the President, Jeffrey Clark, your subordinate at DOJ, reportedly told you that your days as acting Attorney General were numbered and that DOJ was going to stop Congress from certifying the election results. Is that true?
Congressman, the items you're talking about, I have seen media accounts of, as I'm sure you have, but that set of episode, if you will, is the subject of an Inspector General investigation, and so I'm just not going to be in a position to discuss that.
So you're not going to talk about a meeting you confirmed you had with the President. I guess you're claiming executive privilege, even though you have not invoked executive privilege formally to the committee prior to your appearance. And now you're arguing that because of a pending IG investigation, an explosive report from reportedly about a conversation you had with Mr. Clark informing you your days were limited and there was going to be an attempt to overturn the results of the election, you're not going to discuss because it's the subject of an IG report. Is that correct?
Congressman, both the Department of Justice and my own counsel had conversations with the committee about the ground rules for my appearing today. So I'm going to conduct myself in accordance with the responsibilities that I have and the ground rules that were discussed.
Well, it is the privilege of any member of this committee to ask a question, Mr. Rosen.
Of course.
And it's also, there's also a formal process for invoking executive privilege, which you have in fact not invoked. Let me just say, Madam Chairwoman, I disavow comments made previously during this hearing about the nature of the insurrection. Rewriting history serves no purpose other than to cover up the violence and the brutality that we experienced and that was exhibited on January 6th. A shame for America, a shame for this Congress. And revisionist history serves no purpose but to cover that up and protect that that brutality and that violence. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Rosen, 4 years ago on January 6, 2017, was it appropriate for Democrats to object to the 2016 presidential election results?
Congressman, I think the things that are appropriate or inappropriate for Congress to do are that all members, of course, and all the rest of us have to adhere to the Constitution. And so I'm going to say that that's an issue for you as members of Congress to assess.
Well, you're former acting attorney general, and we appreciate your service to the country. I'm just asking, was it okay for them to, they've told us we're not allowed to object. We weren't allowed to object on January 6, 2021. In fact, you're not even allowed to co-sponsor legislation that Democrats introduced if you did object to accepting and counting the electors on January 6, 2021. I'm just wanting your thoughts on, was it okay for Democrats to do that on January 6, 2017?
What I would hope is people of all parties, all political perspectives, would respect the Constitution, our system of government, and the rule of law.
And does the Constitution allow members to object to the Electoral College results on January 6 after a presidential election?
My understanding is that it does.
It does, right. And Democrats did it. I mean, we had Jim McGovern, the Democrat chairman of the Rules Committee. He objected to the very first state called. He objected to Alabama back on January 6, 2017. President Trump won by 30 points. Mr. Raskin objected to Florida. Mrs. Waters objected to Wyoming, maybe the only state that President Trump won by more than he won Alabama. She objected to Wyoming. And you're saying that was okay for Democrats to do? Mr. Rosen, that was fine?
Oh, I'm sorry, Congress. I didn't understand if you were asking me to respond to that. Again, I mean, I think
is it okay for Jim McGovern, the Democrat member of Congress, to object to Alabama on January 6, 2017? Is that all right? He's allowed to do that, right?
I think if members are adhering to their constitutional rights and roles and responsibilities, that's, again, a question for all the folks in Congress.
And Ms. Waters can object to Wyoming, even though President Trump won Wyoming by like 40 points. She can object to that if she wants to, right?
Well, at least the Constitution allows members of Congress to raise objections.
Yeah. We've heard a lot of talk from the Democrats about revisionist history and the big lie. I just think it's important that we've had Democrat members of Congress tell us that we weren't allowed to object, that somehow we were trying to overturn the will of the American people, even though we objected to states like Pennsylvania, for example, where they, I believe in an unconstitutional fashion, changed their election laws in the run-up to the election, but somehow they're allowed to object to Alabama, they're allowed to object to Wyoming, they're allowed to object to Florida, but we're not allowed to object. I fail to see the logic there. How about the previous gentleman from Virginia talked about brutality, talked about statements. I just want to read you a couple statements here. Well, no, let me ask you this question first. Was the 2016 election stolen?
I do not know of evidence that would say it was. I think you're alluding to a troublesome thing about the legitimacy of our past elections, sometimes governor's races being called into question. And I think it's really necessary and important for all of us to find ways to restore our citizens' faith in the electoral process and in our representative system of government.
Secretary Clinton said on a speaking tour, May 2019, you can run the best campaign, you can even become the nominee, and you can have the election stolen from you. September 2019, she said on CBS Sunday Morning that President Trump was an illegitimate president. On October 2020, just a month before our last presidential election, she was referring to the 2016 presidential election, and she said it was stolen from her. Is she wrong?
She is wrong.
Yeah, she is wrong, because the election was valid in 2016. President Trump won. So when we talk about revisionist history that we've heard from the Democrats, when we talk about the big lie, their nominee, as recently as last October, was saying the election in 2016 was stolen. They can object to Alabama, they can object to Wyoming, they can object to states when in 2017, but we're somehow not allowed to object to anything and raise points about the 2020 election. It's not about revisionist history. It's about the double standard the Democrats want to have. That's the part that bothers me the most. And frankly, I think that's what bothers the American people the most. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurthy, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Mr. Miller, you don't deny that at least 4 people died in connection with January 6th, correct?
I don't know how to answer that.
You don't.
Yes
you
or
don't,
no?
yes.
It's not that easy. It's just not that easy to
And
respond
sir,
to that.
140
What
police
for?
officers. 140 police officers were injured, right?
I don't know.
And 2 Capitol police officers later died by suicide, correct?
I don't know.
Hundreds
That's
of
what I read in the
rioters
paper.
breached the Capitol, right?
I'm sorry?
Hundreds of rioters breached the Capitol on January 6th, correct?
Yes.
Now, sir, I want to highlight a paragraph in a Vanity Fair article about you from January, in that in response to the critique that you were too slow responding to the January 6th breach, you said, quote, "I know for an absolute fact that historians are going to look and go, those people had their game together." Mr. Miller, I have a picture of January 6th and what the nation saw on TV. I can assure you these pictures of mayhem and insurrection do not suggest anyone had their game together that day. Let me turn your attention to another topic, namely Russia. You said, quote, "I have professional respect for how they do things. I kind of, like professionally, I'm like, wow, they're doing pretty well, and they're using a lot of irregular warfare concepts, information, all this stuff in a way that, like, oh, good on them." Mr. Miller, according to the ODNI, on March 10th, 2021, Russia interfered in the 2016 and 2020 elections, correct?
I didn't read that report.
On top
I'll
of
take
that,
the
Russia
report.
invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea, right?
I am aware of that. Yes, sir, they did.
Mr. Miller, you know Vladimir Putin tried to kill his political opponent, Alexei Navalny, with a nerve agent, correct?
I don't know what that has to do with the subject of this
Mr.
hearing.
Miller, according to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, Russia is responsible for SolarWinds, the largest cyber attack waged ever against the U.S. in our history. You're aware of that, right?
I thought I was here to discuss the unexplained delays and unanswered questions of the event of 6 January.
Sir, you said good on them with regard to Russia. Meanwhile, regarding the Department of Defense, which you headed, you told Vanity Fair, quote, "This effing place is rotten." I think your comments, Mr. Miller, about Russia and the DOD are bizarre and rotten, and I think they illustrate, unfortunately, the problems of the response on January 6th. So now let me turn to January 6th. On January 3rd, you informed the President that Mayor Bowser requested National Guard support. And according to page 11 of your written statement, the President said to give the mayor the support she requested, correct?
Yes.
On January 6th, according to your statement, you became aware sometime on or before 1:30 p.m. that day that the rioters breached the perimeter of the Capitol, right?
Yes.
According to a DOD-created timeline, at 1:34 p.m., Mayor Bowser called Army Secretary McCarthy to request, quote-unquote, additional forces to respond to the Capitol. According to page 8 of your statement, at 3:04 p.m., so 1.5 hours later, you authorized mobilizing the D.C. National Guard and providing these additional forces. That constituted a gap of 1.5 hours. During that 1.5-hour gap, why did you and the Secretary disobey the President's order to give the mayor the support she requested?
She already had the support she requested. What's your question, sir?
Sir, she requested additional support. You see this mayhem and pictures of insurrection on January 6th? She requested additional support from you. And during that 1.5 hours, either you disobeyed an order given to you by the President to help Mayor Bowser, or the President changed his order and asked you to delay support, or you just plain froze and were indecisive while people were being injured, killed, while hundreds of rioters breached the Capitol, and a nation was traumatized. Sir, because of your actions,
There were
I will be,
8,000 badged and credentialed police officers on duty.
and
The
you weren't there.
United States
They
Armed
were,
Forces should
and
only
you
be
were
used as a
AWOL.
last
You were
resort.
AWOL, Mr. Secretary. You were AWOL. Remember,
That's
as
completely
you said
inaccurate.
before,
That's completely inaccurate.
as you said before, you have responsibility for everything. Something goes wrong, quote unquote, I own it completely, 110%. Sir, you partially own this mayhem. And that's why I'm going to ask for a DOD investigation into your actions. Thank you.
I already requested that before I left the Department of Defense.
I look forward to the report. Thank you, sir.
Gentleman's time expires. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, is now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, constitutionalists support peaceful assembly to redress grievance. We do not support violent protest. Today, we're discussing the forced occupation and violent protest of January the 6th. Unfortunately, my colleagues across the aisle who hold the majority choose to present this hearing today through a 100% political prism. The founders were concerned about this. Madison wrote in Federalist 10 that liberty is to faction as air is to fire, that a dangerous or disturbing faction could indeed be born within this new republic based upon the very liberties and freedoms that the citizens were being provided. And yet none would argue that liberty should be eliminated in order to control a dangerous or disturbing faction. Madison and Hamilton agreed that the answer would be a stronger faction to be born within the citizenry to counter the disturbing or dangerous faction. I would argue that many Americans have come to believe that Congress has become a disturbing faction in America. My colleagues are referring to the actions of January the 6th. If they completely ignore the language and influence that their own members cause across the country. Maxine Waters, well, we've got to stay on the street. We've got to get more active. We have to get more confrontational. We have to make sure they know we mean business. Kamala Harris. But they're not going to stop. They're not going to stop. They're not. This is a movement, I'm telling you. They're not going to stop. And everyone beware. Representative Presley, there needs to be unrest in the streets. Nancy Pelosi, I just don't know why there aren't uprisings all over the country. Maxine Waters, in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out there and you create a crowd and you push back on them and you tell them they're not welcome here anymore. 19 people died during BLM riots last year. Hundreds and hundreds were injured. 2,000 police officers were injured from BLM riots last year. And yet, we're going to discuss today, as if none of that happened, the events of January the 6th. The hypocrisy of this body is indeed disturbing to the scores of millions of Americans that supported President Trump and loved this country and have been denied access to their own capital for over a year. Chief Conte, let's jump into some law enforcement here, shall we, sir? Be prepared for a question. Chief Conte, does the United States Capitol Police utilize facial recognition as a technology?
I don't know what the United States Capitol Police use, sir, in terms of.
I thought you might be aware of that based upon your background. I'm sure you stay up with it. Do you have an